The Tao of the world has much more political and social bite. I kind of compare it to it really skewers the rich like a chicken satay, which is my favorite Singapore dish, and kind of grills them on top of an open flame.
I'm Amil Niazi, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. There's a new play out of the Stratford Festival right now. It's a biting satire that people have described as an Asian rom-com meets 1700s restoration comedy. The Tao of the World by playwright Jovanni Sy tackles Singapore's ultra-wealthy elite, and Joshua Chong is here to tell us all about it. Welcome back to the show, Joshua.
Good morning, Amil. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Joshua, before we get into the meat of this, can you just quickly tell us what is this play about?
The Tao of the world is really about the hypocrisy of the rich. It looks at how they want to have their cake and eat it at the same time. At the center of this story, which is set in Singapore just after the pandemic reopening, about 2022, 2023, is Arabella. She's our main narrator. She's a socialite and a scion to this huge fortune. She's married to this British immigrant. She's in an unhappy marriage. She has her eyes set on this movie star named Edward. Edward, however, is in love with Arabella's cousin, Millicent. So that's the central love triangle there. And both of them are fighting for this man. But what it's really about is that, they're not looking to go into these relationships for love. It's all about consolidating power. So they kind of rope in all their friends, their family members, and it kind of creates this really messy but delicious entanglement that kind of blows up in their faces.
Okay, I love the sound of that. You were actually there on opening night. What did you think of the play?
I mostly enjoyed it. It is really plot heavy and it moves super quickly. It's 2 acts with 1 intermission, 2 hours and 20 minutes. The first act kind of sets everything up, right? All the relationships. And then the second act is when everything unravels. There's a lot of backstabbing, political backstabbing, family members turning on each other. It's quite difficult to follow at times, but it's everything that you expect from a comedy of this kind. There is disguises, there are mistaken identities. There's a lot, especially in the second act, a lot of physical humor and physical comedy. So I think what worked for me really was the comedy, even though at times it's one of those plays where you have to tell yourself, like, the plot here really doesn't matter. You don't need to remember who is betraying whom, who is in love with whom, and just kind of go with it.
Right. Immerse yourself in what's happening.
Exactly.
So I mentioned off the top that the play looks at Singapore's ultra-wealthy elite, and so inevitably, it invites comparisons to things like Crazy Rich Asians. But what do you think this play does differently from that?
Yeah, there will be a lot of comparisons to Crazy Rich Asians because in popular media, there is so little focus on Singapore culture. Both are set in Singapore, both kind of focus on the upper crust. But that really, for me at least, is where the similarities end. Whereas Crazy Rich Asians kind of plays with the ultra-rich like a cat would play with a ball of yarn. The Tao of the world has much more political and social bite. I kind of compare it to it really skewers the rich like a chicken satay, which is my favorite Singapore dish, and kind of grills them on top of an open flame. So it is really funny, but underneath of that, there's this real undercurrent of social and class commentary, which is what really makes this play not just engaging, but thought-provoking.
So we talked about this idea of it being like a classic restoration comedy. For those who don't know what that means, can you give us a little background on that genre and how it relates to this?
Yeah, the Tao of the World is actually loosely inspired on a very famous restoration comedy by William Congreve from 1700 called The Way of the World. And the restoration comedy era was kind of from 1660 to 1710. And during the reign of King Charles II, this was after, of course, the Puritans were ruling England and theaters were shut down for 18 years. So this was kind of the reopening of the theaters, right? And during this period, you had a lot of comedies that focused on the hypocrisy of the upper class, the immorality of the upper class, and how they kind of lived their lives at the expense of those underneath them, the working class, the proletariat. And this kind of created the Restoration comedy, or what we know today as a comedy of manners. And that has lived on well beyond the Restoration era with shows like, The Importance of Being Earnest, or this show, The Tao of the World.
So this show takes place after the lockdowns of the COVID-19 pandemic. And curious how that spirit of the Restoration play that you were just talking about fits into that period.
Yeah. Jovanni Sy really takes elements of the Restoration comedy but really subverts it. So the first act is a really conventional comedy of manners that focuses and skewers the upper class. But the second act kind of flips it on his head. I said earlier that, the primary narrator of The Tao of the World is Arabella, this upper class socialite. But that narrative perspective really shifts in one key moment in the second act, when it shifts to the working class, the unseen laborers behind the scenes whose labor helps, Arabella, her family, and her friends kind of live this extravagant lifestyle that they have. So that's really fascinating. I think what Jovanni is trying to comment on, and what he has told me in the interviews that I've done with him, is that, this idea of the Restoration comedy, going back to normal after COVID. He really wants to interrogate with this play, back to normal for whom? And what does back to normal mean for people in the upper class compared to those in the working class, especially in Singapore, for whom, back to normal was not something that they ever wanted to go back to.
So writer and director Jovanni Sy is from Montreal, and his last play, Salesman in China, was also a big hit for Stratford. He spoke to guest host Garvia Bailey on Q recently, and here's what he had to say about setting the Tao of the World in Singapore.
No matter if I'm writing about Singapore in 2022 or with Salesman in China as China in 1983 or whatever, I'm always writing about here and now.
Yes.
That's what I'm aiming to do. And so if I wanted to think about what our society was like, Singapore was a really wonderful proxy.
So, Joshua, you were born in Singapore. You spent a lot of time there. How do you feel about what he said there about Singapore as a proxy for Canada?
I agree. It is such a great proxy for Canada because in some ways there are a lot of similarities between Singapore and Canada. Both are incredibly cosmopolitan, melting pots, so many different cultures mingling together. Singapore also has a very complicated colonial history, and that is explored in this show, as well as, the relationship between different classes. I think, as a Singaporean, some of the things didn't work for me because there were some, key historical and factual inaccuracies that perhaps Jovanni stretched a bit too far. So that kind of took me out of it. But I think for, everyday Canadians that are going into it that kind of see Singapore as this kind of utopian myth, the Dubai of Southeast Asia, or whatever that is. This play kind of takes that myth and shatters it, right? And sometimes it takes, as an outsider, looking at a culture different from yours to kind of force you to kind of look inwards and reflect on your own. So although for me it didn't really work for me because that myth of Singapore has already long been shattered, I think for regular Canadian audiences who maybe are unfamiliar with Singapore going into it will take something more out of it than perhaps I did.
Joshua, quickly, I feel like we love these types of rich person satires. I'm thinking White Lotus and the many, many seasons it's inspired, Succession. Why do you think we do love to sort of see the dark side of the wealthy?
I think because shows like these, Succession, White Lotus, The Tao of the World, it's all based on truth. It's based on kernels of truth, and it stretches it, and it turns it into comedy, and it's so delicious, especially for us right now, a lot of working class people. It's easy to feel helpless. And shows like this, don't necessarily, they entertain us, but they also force us to look at the world in a different way as well.
I love that. Well, Joshua Chong, I really appreciate you being here to have this conversation with us.
Thanks for having me.
Joshua Chong is an arts critic with the Toronto Star. He was here with me in Toronto. The Tao of the World is on stage now until September 26th in Stratford.
Driving round with you by my side makes me feel so good, makes me feel alive. Windows down, breeze blowing, don't know where we feel like going, but you're by my side, yeah, you're by my side. Stay by my side, by my side.
That's Driving by Winnipeg's own Amy Chun. It's on her debut EP, Aries Baby. And that's it for the show today. I'm Amil Niazi, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Thanks for listening.
Anywhere you want, yeah.